Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm Bob Attardi with Politics and Prose. Thank you. My colleagues are here. Our fans are here. I oversee classes, day and overseas trips, salons, and book groups. I'd like to thank the staff here at 6th and I for making this evening possible. Our partnership began in 2007, and we in PNP love this venue for author events because, as you see, it's an elegant and historic space. We'd also like to thank all of you, both here in person and those watching virtually, for your support of a nonprofit and an independent bookstore in our continuing efforts to bring together a community of readers and authors. I had the good fortune to hear Ocean Vuong speak a few months ago at the Independent Bookstore Conference, a gathering of booksellers, publishers, and authors. In a passionate talk, Ocean discussed his history as a reader. To this day, he shared that when he steps into a bookstore, he loves to ask, "What do you like to read?" Immediately, I realized this is the voice of an educator, and he gets us. He told us his touch with literature was at a public library in East Hartford, Connecticut, where his mother would drop him off with the instructions to read everything, especially what you don't understand. That directive has stayed with him, and as an English professor at NYU, it has remained a guiding principle, as it is, and I quote, exactly what he tells his students. He continues, "The point of reading is not about completing a book. It's about the book launching you towards other questions." Like I said, he really gets us, and that is why I'm delighted to introduce author Ocean Vuong, an award-winning poet whose collections include Night Sky with Exit Wounds, Time as a Mother. His debut novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, was a bestseller and a millennial classic. Tonight, we celebrate his new novel, The Emperor of Gladness, recently selected by Oprah's book club. And as we know, she does many incredible things, and her influence in the literary world is unparalleled. In describing Emperor of Gladness, Oprah said, "This book is epic, hauntingly beautiful, and you can't help thinking about the characters." We couldn't agree more. The Emperor, let me ask, how many people have read the book already? A few, okay. The Emperor of Gladness is a heartfelt novel that is a profound look at American life through the lenses of love, kindness, humor, work, and loneliness. It tells the story of the intergenerational, multicultural relationship between 19-year-old Hai, a Vietnamese immigrant, and Grażyna Vitkus, an 82-year-old immigrant from Lithuania with dementia and hallucinations of World War II. She takes Hai in to live in her home. He cares for her, and they share their memories and histories as the relationship grows. Hai finds solace in books. We meet his cousin Sony, who loves Civil War history, gets Hai a fast food job and a place called Home Market, and he learns about the illusions of fast food and coworkers' lives. As I read this, I felt the power of Ocean Vuong's empathetic voice. As I know, we are all excited to hear from him about his ideas, his process, and how he creates his narratives. We are thrilled that Ocean is here tonight in conversation with Nicole Chung, the author of the memoirs A Living Remedy and All You Can Ever Know, a finalist for the National Book Award, Circles Award. Please join me in welcoming Ocean and Nicole.
Well, thank you all for joining us. It is such an honor to be here with you all tonight to celebrate Ocean and this beautiful book, The Emperor of Gladness. Ocean, I just want to say thank you for inviting me, and it's really wonderful to see you. This is our first time meeting in person, even though I've had the pleasure of talking with you for hours. I was lucky enough to get to interview you for a magazine once, and that was where I first got to experience like your wisdom and just like follow your mind down all these different paths. How are you? Like, how is tour going for you so far? Is it different than before?
Well, I think this is just an extension of the work. To me, the book has a firm front and back cover, but I think all books are porous at their best, and the ideas and the hopes for them bleed and leak into the world. And so to me, this is just an extension of the work. I don't see it as labor. I see it as an immense privilege. As a poet, I was told to never expect an audience, which is actually very good advice for poets. So it's not lost on me that this is an immense privilege, that the words, which weigh nothing, can bring people and fill this beautiful space. And I'm deeply thankful to be here, and also to talk to you, who I love your work for so long, and the way you think and hold communities. It's always a deep, deep honor to be in conversation with you. I feel like we always discover something new. It's almost like we're digging rather than just talking. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you. It's always felt very collaborative talking with you, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be here tonight. I believe you're planning to open up with a reading from the novel as a treat.
So this book takes place in 2009. It's mostly because I'm a very slow thinker. It takes me about 16 years to process anything. But it takes place in Connecticut. In 2009 was a time where we didn't really have the term opioid epidemic yet, and Purdue Pharma, which is responsible for a lot of this nightmare that the country is now experiencing, was in Stamford, Connecticut. And so it hit us as this wave before we knew what was happening. And so a lot of the book is haunted by this epidemic. The first person Hai saw OD was somebody's dad. He was 12 and had gone over to this girl Jennifer Knoxley's house to do a project for history class. They were in the living room cutting construction paper when her father came in very quietly, like a ghost was wheeling him in, and sat down on the couch. After a while, his head tilted back and his mouth hung open. Eyes rolled into their sockets. He looked like somebody had pressed pause at the peak of him laughing at the greatest joke he'd ever heard. This was the image imprinted on Hai's mind when he signed in at the New Hope Recovery Center. Every generation says this of itself, but these were indeed unprecedented times he lived in. A time before iPhones were everywhere and people still looked up as they walked, their heads filled with self-generated thoughts floating up from deep pits in the subconscious. A time when you still knocked on each other's doors, and if you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to call them on a landline, listen to their mother's breathing for a while, maybe the sound of her fixing a drink or shaving her legs. Then you meet up somewhere, one of you waiting about, shifting your feet and looking at clouds or trees or municipal architecture, cars passing, your dopamine levels higher for not having been depleted from blue light screens throughout the day. A time when the drug dealer on the corner would, out of boredom, start balancing on a chain-link fence, the boy in him unable to help it, pants sagging from the effort, revealing his plaid boxers you can spot from the back window of the school bus. But then, slowly, 1 or 2 or 7 of your friends will find the pills, and they will fill their young brains with artificial joy. And you will join them, running through the woods by the power plant, laughing at the immense night, your head levitating a full foot over your shoulders. And their eventual deaths will not yet be used by politicians to gain traction with the base. It did not have a name, the slaughter, and yet your loved ones were being slowly erased, even teachers and lunch ladies overdosing overnight, then cremated without ceremony, their faces soon existing only in your mind. Those were the times those who lived through it would say, years later, not knowing what it was they meant. Though it was never his drug of choice, he was barely 16 the first time he tried heroin. One summer night at a skate park on the outskirts of town, he sat huddled among 3 other skater boys in the valley of a half-pipe, the candle flame still in the humid air as the spoon sizzled over it, Fugazi's waiting room running on a loop from a stereo in someone's Jansport. The boys had removed their socks, turning their long, bony feet in the light, searching for a good vein. They preferred the feet because it was easier to hide the scars. Plus, they could feel the speed of the hot, acidic rush literally surging through their legs to the tip of their heads, some of them tracing the drug's ascent with their fingers as if pointing to ruined cities on a map. But the sensation for high was more like drowning in his own blood, his neck craning to get above the tide. Soon there was laughter everywhere in the dark, hands slapping bare skin. But a half hour later, the only sound left was Fugazi playing over their gleaming, shirtless chests, mouths gasping like shored fish as fireflies flittered over them in the greenish night. Rehab, if nothing else, was a place to store yourself for a while. It was also, he quickly learned, a kingdom of boredom. But maybe that was the point, the goal even, to be with yourself. All the cliches about it are true. You wait around until whatever poison that's ruining you empties into the world as time. Then you fill that emptiness with more time. Talking, walking around the rec room, listening to people, quote, talk it out, painting watercolors of zoo animals, reading YA or science fiction, the only genres allowed. And after all that waiting, you stand by the barred windows and watch the golden arches of the McDonald's across the parking lot light up, which means it's time for the nurses to switch shifts for the night. And an alcoholic with Down syndrome named Jordan is next to you, pointing out the window, shouting, "It's chicken tender time, it's chicken tender time. Hey guys, it's tender time." The rooms are named after various genus of squash grown in New England, a laminated drawing of each type pasted on the doors. High shared the kabocha room with a sex addict named Marlon, who was strapped to the bedpost with bungee cords to keep him from jerking off. He turned to High one night and said quizzically, "Hey man, I was wondering, how come I never see any Asians in rehab? I've been to like 5 of these joints and never seen one till now." "MSG," I said. "MSG," I said, feeling crazy. "What?" Marlon's eyes widened in the blue wet dark. "It absorbs all the poison. Why you think the government hates this stuff? They don't want you knowing the truth. Then all these places will be out of business. They make a big fuss about how it's bad for you. Anytime the feds say something's bad for you, eat as much of it as you can." Holy shit. Marlon sat up. "It won't work for your stuff, though." "Yeah, no, I get that. And what about you? You couldn't absorb all your MSG or something?" "I was adopted." "Ate mostly waffles my whole life and now I'm fucked." Damn, dude. Marlon lay silent all night, this new knowledge burrowing through him. His straps clinking on the bedpost as he tossed about.
I'm going to change my lead-off question because of that reading. So we were talking a little bit in the green room before this about the humor in this book. Let's just get it out there right at the beginning. It's funny. Like, it is also beautiful and haunting and traumatic and, like, wrenching, but it's funny. And, you know, you were saying what a difference that was from your first book. And I'm just curious, like, was this always there? Was this always kind of the plan to write like a really funny second novel? Where did this come from?
Well, my friends were really befuddled after my first novel because they said, Ocean, you're so funny. Your books are so sad. And that reputation has only been cemented by all the media photos, right? Because I promise you, we have very lovely photo shoots, and there's a lot of jokes, but the editors always pick the saddest photo. Right? They said, we gotta get the sad refugee to look really sad. And so I thought, all right, this is my revenge, you know. But I suppose in all seriousness, the first novel, and also the first book of poems, it was not my history. I don't tell other people's stories in my work. I have never interviewed my family. I don't tell anyone's stories in this new novel either. To me, I'm inspired by their lives, but I ethically have chosen not to turn their lives into my art. I've never asked my mother questions for my art. We had conversations, but I can't bring it to myself to bring up really painful things and then turn it into my work. And so to me, fiction is the supreme promise of creating a simulation and the ultimate reverence to lived lives, historical lives, and to look at those lives perhaps in the same way Tolstoy looked at his milieu and said, I am inspired by you, but for me, I won't replicate your life in my work. So having their lives haunt my first two debuts, I knew that I couldn't joke about it. It would be, and there was also an awareness. You know, Toni Morrison said it best. She said, I know because of the mechanics and the economics of book publishing, this is Morrison saying, that most of my readers will be white, but I'm still writing for young black women. And so there's a kind of discernment between audience and authorial agency. And so I too knew that most of my readers will be non-Vietnamese people. And I just didn't want the invitation to laugh at us, laugh at my elders' historical lives. Whereas in this book, it was more my history. And I would welcome the humor, because I do think absurdity and horror often go side by side, and sometimes we laugh in order not to cry. But it was important to delay the humor in my work. It was also very hard to do. I didn't have the chops 10 years ago when I first started to do humor in a very delicate way. It requires a lot. I think description is in itself somber. You know, if I just describe that stained glass, it's closer to an austerity, neutral description. It's closer to sadness. It's not sad in itself, but it's closer. Description, neutral description is closer to gravitas than it is to humor. So humor, to me, is a higher, a much more, there's a lot more range that you have to cover, and I didn't have the chops as a writer to do it. But the instinct was to not invite humor in the first two works because it was not my history, and I did not want non-Vietnamese readers to laugh at my elders.
So like these different subjects that you're taking on and these different forms, to really explore these obsessions, though, that you've had throughout, I think, your career and across genres and books, these sort of inexhaustible themes, how do you decide which form you're going to work on? And I'm curious just kind of how your poetry over the years and its evolution has shaped your prose.
Oh, thank you for that. Well, I've never had any allegiance to any genre, and I think it's interesting as a teacher because in our culture, we often ask our students to kind of pledge dogmatic allegiance to the medium before realizing their visions, right? What do you want to be? Photographer? Okay, do that. Here's a camera, go forth. And same with, even in our program, the students introduce each other by saying, hey, I'm John, I'm poetry, what are you? Oh, I'm Samantha, I'm fiction, right? And so we ask our students to kind of declare our majors, declare our mediums. And I never felt, historically, that's never been true. Look at Michelangelo, Da Vinci, look at Melville, right? He wrote more lines of poetry than Dickinson and Whitman combined. Hardy, so many folks. And so to me, I've always felt that the questions come first, and then you approach the medium with curiosity. What will my questions funneled through the medium look like? And so poetry was my first love, but I don't have any dogmatic kinship to it. So I've always asked, is there another form that I can ask the same questions in? Because when I wrote my first book of poems, I realized that there was commercial anxiety to making any book. And right away, editors, friends were saying, well, now what are you going to do? You wrote about, Vietnamese history and American violence. Now what? As if you should then forget all that and write about sci-fi or something, And I guess I never felt that any book is a finite container of our questions. Again, I feel like the book is truly porous, which I feel like that's what I feel about religious texts. I think they're porous texts. It's not about what is in them, it's what they radiate and how that radiation affects human life. And so I've always tried to find a different way to say the same thing. And in finding a different way, you end up saying a different thing. And so with the first novel, I was deeply interested in writing a novel as an artist statement. I knew that I did not want to just have folks sit back and relax and enjoy the show, especially when I'm writing about, I didn't want to be a tour guide of Vietnamese pain. And so it ended up being kind of like a strange monologue from a son to a mother. But I did it was almost like a Swiss Army knife as a novel. There are 3 point of views, first, second, third. There are plotted sequences in that first novel, but then impressionistic. It was kind of like the gamut. It's a true hybrid text, inspired by Lynn Haginian, Juna Barnes, Marguerite Duras, all these strange texts. But I wanted to show that I could, because before writing that book, I practiced short stories, which you'll never see them. But I used the short story as a laboratory, as a training ground to learn how to write fiction. But I knew that I couldn't just write a conventional novel, not as a poet. And also, as my debut, I wanted to have an artist statement first, a philosophical treatise on why I had to refuse to tell the story. I had to keep refusing to have people go on a ride, right? I was inspired by James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, where that book takes place in one day, almost 300 pages, one day. And what I learned in that book was Baldwin said, I had to write that book in order to write anything else. It was his debut. And what he did was so incredible to this day. He was trying to tell the story of a black family in Harlem coming out of the Great Migration. And he knew, as a black writer in the 50s and 60s, that the publishing world would really want him to tell the authentic world of Harlem, that they could experience Harlem without ever stepping foot in it. In other words, a tour guide. But what he did was really interesting. He invited everyone on the tour bus, and he did a kind of Trojan horse. And he got on the bus, he picked up the mic, and he said, all right, there's no wheels, but you're going to hear me talk for 300 pages. And what he did was he turned every character into a portrait gallery. That book is a portrait gallery. Every character was a doorway. He truncated the plot to one day. He froze time, and I said, oh, he's doing a sermon. That book is a sermon. He wanted to be a preacher. And not only that, but he turned the book into a lyric poem. He condensed time, and he spent time on people. That changed everything to me. And I said, okay, I can do the same with this project with Vietnamese history. And so the first book was an artist statement. This book is me trying to walk the walk and put all that into motion.
I remember you telling me the first time we talked that the work of a writer is just to be curious, and that you move through your work the same way you move through the world. It's always a matter of asking the questions that help you move deeper into what you want to be doing and what you want to be thinking about. And so I'm just curious, like, moving to the Emperor of Gladness, what were some of those questions or curiosities or mysteries that really started you on your way with this particular book? How'd you know this was the book you needed to write?
Oh gosh. Well, I was interested and troubled by Western narratology, and my main interest in this book was, can I tell a story that defies all the writing books you sort of decree that you needed change for a story to be valuable? And I thought, okay, I understand that. I love those stories myself. But American life, as I saw it, was actually very static, even at its best. Mm-hmm. But being static is not doomed. I know people in my community work the same job for 20, 30 years, drive the same car, live in the same apartment. And the American mythos would deem that they have failed. And when you have casual conversations, you know, my brother works his whole life at Dick's Sporting Goods, and he loves that job. He told me the other day, he said, Ocean, I think I'm going to work here for the rest of my life. And he was so proud. And he's the shoe lead, you know. And I told him, I said, well, you can do that because I pay your rent. But that's the blessing, right? I said, but go forth. Let your dream come true. But, you know, do you see that light that you keep on till 2 a.m. playing Call of Duty, right? But I'm also deeply reverent of that, right? Because I'm not like that. I would find a cliff very quickly. But he can just work 9 to 5. And so I thought, in every sense, in the American rubric, my brother is a failure, right? There's even when he says that, sometimes there's a guest, come, he'll say, and then there's a kind of lull, like, oh, and then what, right? My stepdad works at this company called Stanadyne in Connecticut for 25 years. And for 25 years, from 3 p.m. to 12 a.m., I barely saw him. He made a screw that goes into a gas pump. That's all he did for 25 years. And when that company shut down, he went to make another screw for Colt. It went in, a screw that went into the Colt Magnum, another Connecticut company. And that, to me, is a quintessential American story. Gas pumps and guns, right? And, if you asked him, how is your life, right? He's 67 now. He would have said he lived out his dream as a refugee. That's what he had a job. He was respected in our community. Our relatives called him the mayor, right? When I was little, they called him, hey, what's going on, mayor? And I didn't realize they called him that because he had insurance. He had a salary, right? So the relativity of all that. And what I saw was this deep immense amount of pride. And so I wanted to tell a story where people transformed without change. I knew it's not a spoiler to say no one gets a raise, no one's fate is changed, there's no windfall, there's no rags to riches. So if you shut that down, if you close that parameter, you have a tight container in which innovation happens internally. And then I thought, oh, where else does that happen? The sonnet. The sonnet is accredited to being one of the most innovative forms in Anglophonic poetry because of its restrictions. It's an impoverished form, right? The very innovation that happens from Gwendolyn Brooks back to Shakespeare and Petrarch to Ted Berrigan, Bernadette Mayer, all those writers working that sonnet because of its limitations. You're asked to put a tornado inside a jar, in a way. And so the power comes not from the freedom of form, but the restrictions. And then I thought that's also what a fast food restaurant is. The Boston market that I worked in, that little square, right, 1,000 square feet, 7, 8 employees in there. It's a sonnet. You can't get out. The shift is a sonnet. There's no escape. You have to find a way. You have to find a way to laugh, to innovate. Some of the most innovative, creative people, the people I met working those shifts. The second day on the job, I saw someone glue a chicken drumstick to the freezer to keep it open. And that was the best answer because you needed it to close just a bit, to move back and forth. You also needed to keep it open so people don't get locked inside. And someone just taped a drumstick to the door. And I'll probably remember that to the day I die. But so I just thought, let me try to launch this inquiry and go against this faux pas of storytelling. And if I may just digress a little more, because when I started to teach, I started to realize, where does Western narratology come from? And of course it comes from Plato. He famously banished the poets. We poets, we love when people talk about us because we don't get a lot of shine. So poets usually, hey, Plato banished us, remember? But for Plato, he also included in the word poets storytellers. And it's really interesting. His fear was because he was afraid that poetry would make the military class too emotional. So he believed in good story, like stories that support and confirm the Republic. He said, once we get a canon that confirms the Republic, we can stop new poetry from developing and we can banish them. It's a fascistic impulse, right? And we've seen it happen from Hitler to Stalin to Pol Pot, maybe even again in this country. So the idea was to to have only the good myth. And that's true when we think about the myths of this country, right? There will never be, I believe, a political candidate that will criticize George Washington, right? Not a successful one. It's an original sin to critique, right? The myth, the founding myths. And so similarly, Plato wanted a solid founding myth that no one could critique. His student Aristotle had a much more level-headed, and he said, all right, well, it's unfeasible to keep banishing poets. What will we do? But he also agreed. They were both aristocrats, most likely slave owners. And Plato said, well, what if we use the poets and the storytellers to ameliorate, create stories that will ameliorate the public's vexation with the state and the society through catharsis, right? In other words, if story was a way to drain the abscess of civic unrest, and if we could do it regularly, we can prevent revolution and uphold the republic. And I thought, gosh, what a way to start. And of course, it's so influential. And I'm not here to say that that's an unproductive way. One of my favorite stories followed that arc. But I thought, can there be another way? And of course, when we think about the novel, the first novelist in our species is Lady Murasaki, a Japanese woman in the Japanese court who wrote a novel in the year 1011, a 1,000-page novel. And it's really fascinating. One of my favorite kind of like reasons to write anything. When asked, why did you write this 1,000-page novel? She was an assistant to a court matron, right? So she was, did the hair and everything. And she said, why did you write this novel? And she said, I was bored. And to me, it's such a different, vastly different position from the two dudes, Plato and Aristotle. And to me, it's one of the greatest kind of justifications to ask then, certainly what would happen. At least we should try what would happen if we had a woman president in this country. Because you have a woman who, in the first novelist of our species, asking a question about wonder, about dreaming, centering curiosity. God forbid, what would happen if we centered curiosity, if we told stories or made art not to control or condemn people, but to move towards a more expansive, methodology. And of course, this is not an East or West kind of battle, because the East have gone, incredibly fascistic in many ways as well, right? But it's interesting for me to kind of think globally. And as a teacher, I'm always having my students have one eye beyond the borders of what we have here to find different solutions and strategies to tell your stories.
You just brought up students now, and we were talking again in the green room about how you taught this last semester in the run-up to this book, and I'm sure that must have been exhausting. But I'm curious just how also your teaching is integrated into your writing, and like more specifically maybe where you're talking about letting the questions, and the what happens if we do this kind of drive your writing or your search for form or your exploration of themes. What do you tell your students, or maybe what would you tell anyone in the audience who's interested in writing, not how to write, that's kind of an impossible, but how to sustain it, right? Because for so many reasons, some that you just touched on, this isn't an easy world in which to do that, to kind of stay on that path.
Well, Baldwin perhaps said it best. He said it's not about talent. He said, I've seen many talented ruins. It is about endurance. And I tell that to my students as well. And this is my 11th year teaching. I was very fortunate to teach very young, and I grew up with my students. They helped me think better. There are days where I'm just flattened by the world, and I show up to 12 people who have the utmost hope, nearly psychotic hope. They have decided to commit their life to turn a few words into impossible meaning, and to choose a form wherein they must break the line after a handful of words, and to choose a form that shatters itself towards completion in the lyric poem. And yet they arrive every week with utmost hope and excitement. The greatest cure to depression is to be a teacher. At times, it also induces it. I would be remiss if I did not mention that part. But I tell them, you're going to have to survive, because everything outside of the classroom is hell-bent on snuffing you out in this culture. And there is a great discrepancy on how we treat the artist and how we treat the profit maker. The artist is always told to be humble, to perform humility, be grateful for what you have. You have a seat at the table, put your head down. Any major ambition that's articulated, particularly by a young person who didn't have the opportunity or the training to prove themselves yet, they say, who do you think you are? Well, you want to do something like that? What are you, Mark Twain? I don't think so, right? We do this to our young artists again and again. We beat them down so hard that by the time they show up to my class, I teach a graduate class, and they're already, they're only 22, 23. They're already racked with shame. You can feel it in their bodies, how they carry themselves. Their eyes are cast down. And so they come to my class surviving this culture. Meanwhile, the people who make bombs are never humble. I have never heard someone who make weapons say, we're going to lower the blast radius this year because we did it too much. I've never heard anyone on Wall Street or a CEO said, we crushed it last quarter. Let's be humble and pull back and have a little less profit this time. Right? We celebrate endless growth. We fetishize, this phallic sort of spewing of profit and power mindlessly. We innately clap for it, and it's never questioned. And when it comes to our artists, we ask them to do the impossible, make meaning out of all this mess. And then we ask them to bow their heads and never ask more of themselves. And so I think it's really, really challenging to then try to lead a group of young people up against all that. And so I tell them, you will grow. You're going to spend 2 years here, and I promise you, get this concern off your plate. You will improve. And it doesn't even have anything to do with NYU. You can be in your mother's basement working diligently for 2 years. You will be a better writer. You can be in an apartment. You can work in a warehouse and scribble and read at night after your shift, and you will improve. Do anything with care, and you will improve. The challenge is, can you survive so that you improve and show up to yourself 5 years from now as you grow, 10 years from now? Will you still be there for that version of yourself 10 years from now? Because everything outside this room is going to try to snuff you out. And so to me, it's really about giving them a set of tools so that they can be their own engines. When you look out in the middle of the night at the dark window and your friends, your teachers, your mentors are no longer there, do you have the fortitude? And it really is about fortitude. I mean, you know this better than anyone else. People ask me, how can you be so vulnerable? How do you do that? And some people say, gosh, you have so much, you talk with charisma and all that. I said, it's not charisma, it's fortitude. I arrive at the page and on the stage or wherever I am, knowing that there's a group of elders and ancestors and teachers who have believed in me. I step into the room with them behind me. That's what you're feeling. It's not inner confidence, it's not ambition, it's not charisma. It is the fortitude and it's the sense of debt that I feel I owed to these people who believed in me at times that I didn't believe in myself. And so as a teacher, the greatest gifts of my life is to give back this tremendous wealth that has been given to me that can never be measured. And to me, I feel like I can say that teaching is truly my vocation, whereas writing is more a phenomena. It doesn't, writing one book doesn't mean one could or should write another. There are more events. But if I look at myself and I would identify myself, it would be a teacher, because that I can do for the rest of my life. I don't think I would write for the rest of my life.
Everyone in this room wishes you were their writing teacher, I have to say. So you're writing about some of the hardest things, and you're trying to teach and help and support your students, give them what they need to stay on this path in this field for however many years. And it's interesting, you said you started writing this book because you wanted to see what would happen in a novel without great change, on the character's part. And I saw that you referred to it somewhere else as a theme is kindness without hope in this book. It's interesting. I don't want to disagree with you. That feels cheeky. I will say where there's hope in this book, it's a little bit surprising or hard fought. Where there's healing, it's kind of jagged and incomplete. That's life. But I do think in your work, all of your work, there's this sort of idea or an iteration of a way forward. Not necessarily the future will be bright, but there will be some kind of future. I hope I'm not wrong in saying that. I feel like that's something you're always able to leave your readers with, and it's something I personally am really grateful for when I read your work. And I think it's actually really hard to do. It's very easy to say, that a story can show some kind of way forward. It's much harder to do in a way that feels true, right, and not contrived. I don't know if you could talk a bit about that, if that is something that you agree with, and if it's something you're consciously trying to do. Why does that feel important across your works?
I do believe that. I mean, in my last book of poems, which I got to be here to talk about, there's a line that says, "I'm the last of my kind," at the beginning of Hope. And I do believe that is a kind of North Star. But I'm interested in hopelessness as well. And maybe there's a kind of semantic aporia here, that I believe that inside hopelessness is where some of the most interesting and thereby hopeful things occur. This book begins with a character on a bridge about to leap. It's suicide is a very personal thing for me. I lost 2 friends in high school to it. I lost my uncle to it in 2012. He was 28, I was 24, so we were basically brothers. And in society, we often hear the news segment of the person at the ledge, and then they get talked off the ledge and everybody kind of claps. There's a kind of relief. And I've always wondered if we're really clapping for them, or are we clapping because the norm has been restored. There's nothing that says we are not well or we are not okay than an image of a person on the ledge, right? And we often feel this great relief, oh, okay, good. They've been talked down. And that's usually where a lot of stories end, a lot of news segments end, a lot of novels and films. But I thought, at the heart of suicide is an act of hope, right? One does that with the hope of ending immense suffering. I would go on to say it's a hopelessly hopeful act. And so when someone is talked off the ledge, I think they're talked off the ledge into a corner. They still don't have the answers. They still don't have the hope of agency, and yet they have decided to give it another go. It's a question I never got to ask my uncle or my friends. And so I wanted to start my novel with that impossible question. What does day 2 look like for someone who decides to live again? What does day 3, day 20? And what I found is that it's often not a grand reason. In this, it's not too much of a giveaway to realize that this young man is about to jump, and he sees an older woman doing her laundry, and the wind is just taking the laundry into the river. And he forgets, and so he shouts out impulsively, "Hey, your sheets!" And it's not so much that he finds a reason to live, but he forgets to die because there's another person in need, even that small gesture. And so I felt like for me, it's not the big reasons that we want it to be. We want that. I know we want that in our culture, and it feels good, but the reality often is that it's the smallest gestures, and often it's the realization that we are more useful to other people than we are to ourselves that keep us here. And I tell my students the same way. I said, look, I know it's hard. The world is on fire, metaphorically and figuratively. However, it has always been on fire. There has never been a single author that had the immense luxury of writing at a time of absolute peace. And so, choosing this work, you are entering a lineage of despair. And it's up to you to turn the sentence into a medium from which we can understand each other and make something new out of this. It's the most powerful thing, but also the most incredibly restrictive thing. And I always set the first class with that tone. And because I think it is hard, but it has always been so. However, we as writers now, having come so late to the canon, have an immense wealth of the archive. I get to write a novel having read all of Toni Morrison's work, all of James Baldwin, all of Virginia Woolf, all of Melville. They did not have themselves. Toni Morrison had to write those incredible books without a Toni Morrison. Could you imagine? How? Maxine Hong Kingston, the same thing. And so I tell them, like, you come late, how lucky, welcome. You come late, and because of that, you have over 4,000 years of people who tried it before you. And my goodness, what a wealth. And so on the darkest days of our work, all we have to do is look at the library, just glance at it. And you said, gosh, the map is already drawn. I just have to step right into it. What an immense luxury. Could you imagine to be the caveman who had to write the first story or tell the first story?
Like paint the first
My
story.
goodness, where do you begin? Right? No models. So on the worst days, just that knowledge alone, coming so late, gives me immense hope.
I have so many more questions for you. I think I will make this my last one just because the audience did such a great job in coming up with questions. I do want to give you a chance to answer those. But one of the things you were thinking a lot about the first time we spoke was how to care for the people in your life. And that is a theme that runs through this book, really, in their different hopeless, broken ways. These are all people who are trying to make things just a little bit better, I think, for the people around them. So this question of how to use what little you have to help people you care about find whatever it is, safety, rest, care that they need, is something I think about a lot too, about who I have and what I want my family and my life to look like, how to build space where people I love can be okay. You have this wonderful quote in the book, okay was even better than happy because I thought it had a better chance of lasting. So these are all people trying to help each other be a little bit more okay. Can you talk about what that means and why it matters so much to you to offer that kind of rest and care to the people you love and to explore that in your work.
Oh, thank you for that. Well, I think happiness has been so commodified in our culture and turned into this self-optimization, maxing.
This thing you achieve.
Yeah, and it works very. It's been captured by capitalism and commerce, because we keep moving the goalposts of happiness, and as we move, there's always sign up for my class. There's always a yoga class. There's always a retreat. There's always something, and I think in many ways happiness has been almost a tyrannical function in our culture, and some of the most painful things. And I know we mean very well when we say it, but some of the most painful things we can say to a friend or a child is, "I just want you to be happy." It's so hard to do. There are thousands of books out there, and none of them thus far, as long as I know, has been able to give us a true manual that can promise happiness. You know, it's you're better off finding a manual to bathe cats. But happiness is so elusive and often random, arbitrary. And so I think for me, I was deeply interested in perhaps okayness, contentment, fulfillment. What does that look like, right? Because it feels like something that is much harder to be captured by a company, right? Okayness, right? It doesn't ring really. It doesn't have a sharp ring to it. You know, it's like we promise to make you okay. Geico will make sure you're doing just decent. You know, and so because of that, I think there's a lot to be explored there, and we can do a lot to make room for that. And maybe it's because I come from, folks who are refugees, who have a very different rubric of what is safety, what is a good life. And I remember very, very starkly arriving in America, sponsored by the Salvation Army, having been in a refugee camp under a tin shack with 3 other families for 9 months in the Philippines. We're sponsored into Hartford, Connecticut, 7 of us in a 1-bedroom apartment. I remember very clearly my grandmother coming to the window and lifting the window up and down, up and down. She says, "Look, there's locks. Look how thick this glass is. This is America." And I know it sounds, it's for me, it's both heartbreaking and also prideful. I understand that what she meant was that we now have a place of our own, and we have a sense of protection that we've never had before. But I also am deeply sad that there was so much wonder for so little, which also speaks to the immense amount of deprivation that she had to withstand, right? Even in her moments of joy, I saw the immense loss behind it. But what I also learned was that okayness was such a wonderful, sustainable thing, and that if we can bring our best minds to it, imagine what we would do. And I think also, in the same way, we are a culture that really fetishizes talent. We love artistic talent, athletic talent, musical talent, mathematics. We bring all these people with talent on a pedestal. But what would happen if we had instead not prodigies of talent, but prodigies of kindness? What would happen to our pedagogy if we built an epistemology of kindness, if we really studied it and elevated children who come with it? A lot of them come with it, and then the competition that we force them in to develop talent beats it out of them. Imagine what would happen if we realigned our values and really instilled in them and celebrate them for having this innate ability. Because I've talked to enough kids and done enough workshop with elementary schools, and I said, some of them, it's usually the children who knows first who is in trouble in a room. They'll know, they might not have the words, but they will clock who is in trouble first. They're the first one to know it. And to me, I'm interested in that tremendously. What would happen to our culture? What could we achieve if we started to celebrate people who really, really have that ability and let them be a kind of beacon to aspire to, rather than just all the other sort of, traditional realms of conquest and high achievement?
I'm going to start now with audience questions. There are 500 of them, so get comfortable. In the Emperor of Gladness, this question is from Lindsay. In Emperor of Gladness, you display the incredible ability to make the mundane seem miraculous by calling on the power of observation. And there's a line in the book, too, I think. Gladstena says to Hai, you're going to go get a job and be the most considerate observer this town has ever seen, which is stuck in my head for some reason. But what advice do you have for aspiring novelists about honing their observation skills? And where did yours come from?
Well, Simone Weil said the best quote, I think. She says, the greatest act of generosity is to pay attention. To pay attention to something is you're surrendering your whole life to it. You're filling the present with it. And the world is truly inexhaustible. You can look at it again and again, and it'll keep giving. But I would also say, I know it's very competitive. Our whole, this whole strata, our society works on competition, both here and elsewhere. It's not just quintessentially American. And so you feel like you have to always fight for your work. And there's this kind of hustle culture that you have to run ahead and pry open the doors for your work. But I feel like, having done this now for 15 years, I promise you, it's much more capacious if you stand behind your work. If you invest in your work in moments of rejection, in moments of doubt, to return and give another draft to your work will ultimately become the key to open the doors. I've seen people run ahead and really believe that they can pry open the door for their work, and I've seen them do that, and some folks get really, really good at prying open the doors. But when they turn back, they realize the work has evaporated. And so I've always told my students, stand behind your work. It's the most productive thing you can do, is just return to your work again and again and trust that the work itself will open the doors, that the hustle, it looks, glitter, it looks interesting, it looks like it's so productive, but it actually drains the work, and you might not even know it.
Kat asks a question that I was actually thinking of asking you earlier. How much of your writing is for you, for yourself, and how much is for the world? How do you know?
This book was interesting because I never thought I would write a book without my mother being alive, not this early. All the other works, I told myself I was being like a radical author, I was doing my own thing, but at the end of the day, if I'm being honest, I was still trying to strategically build a body of work so that I can get a job teaching, I could take care of my mother, get her out of the projects. And in a way, I was doing the quintessential immigrant son's job. Yeah. Others did it by being lawyers and doctors. I did it by trying to write the best sentences that I can, but I was still beholden to that project. And this book was the first one from start to finish that I wrote without my mother alive. And so I had to ask the question that I thought every author should ask, but I did not really want to ask it this soon, which is, what would I write if I had to write for myself? And I still don't know how to answer that question. You know, it wasn't as great of a feeling that I thought it would be. I think I felt a little I thought this would be like a slump book because I felt I felt really empty when I wrote for myself. I think it's my most self-indulgent book because of that. I think that's okay. I know that's often a critical term, but I'm leaning into that. I think, you know, do we want Toni Morrison to be any less indulgent in herself, right? And so it's a book, and maybe I feel that way only because it's a book that I'm interested in my own themes. It's more closely related to my life. If the first novel is a document, which as a letter to a son, to a mother, that's what it is, it's a document. This one, I asked almost of the protagonist, Little Dog, what would he write if he had to write a debut novel? If he had to write a public-facing novel, which part of his life would he remove? How would he do it in the third person, etc.? The first novel was this private, very intimate document masquerading as a novel. This novel, I'm asking the same character, almost metaphysically, to write his debut. And that was the prompt that I used to work through it.
Writing for yourself, just yourself, kind of for the first time, I'm just curious, did that change your process? Like, from the first novel to the second?
No, not really. To me, the sentence is the building block, and the sentence has to sing. It also has, it clarifies the next sentence. And so I tell my students, it's one sentence at a time. You know, my favorite filmmaker, Kurosawa, he says about script writing, he uses a metaphor. He says, if you're climbing the mountain, never look at the top. You'll never make it if you look at the top, right? You just one step at a time. The process didn't change much, but the questions did. I was less beholden to my family's history, and I was more playful. I was more weird. There's a scene where two people stomp on bread rolls. And, you know, there was a moment years ago, about 10 years ago, when I was walking in Philadelphia, and I kid you not, there was just a stack, a pyramid of croissants underneath a tree by the sidewalk. You know, so it was kind of thrown out, I guess, but it was a stack of croissants. And I don't know what came over me, Nicole. I just, I went and I just started stomping on them. So this is probably something I should bring up to my therapist. But there was just utter delight. And in retrospect, I could say something very academic like, well, the croissant is a symbol of French, French elitism. And the colonial history of France in Vietnam has led us to breathe this deep vexation that has launched my impulse to destroy the croissant at every step. But that would be a revisionist history. The truth is that deep inside me is a 12-year-old boy. And on some days, he goes out and he stomps on croissants. And this is the first time I've allowed him into my novel. But I do recommend it. If you're having a tough day, boy.
Stomp on bread.
When it's nice and crispy, better than Zoloft, I swear.
Okay, Matthew asks about characters.
Is this recorded? Can we?
Matthew says, every character is so fantastically unique. How do you go about creating all the characters in this book? is a lot drawn from your own experience or people in your life?
Well, I think at the heart of it, this is probably more true as a novelist than a poet, but I think it's true as a poet too, to be honest. At the heart of it, to be a writer, you have to be interested in people. You have to be more interested in people than your life affords. You know, that your life is about, we're all stuck in the river of time. Time drags us. We pass people all the time. And so to be a writer is to work in reverse. You're always swimming upstream. You're going back to someone you pass by, and you're trying to fight the stream to look at somebody a little closer. And you realize the more you look, the more the world gives. And so I think at the heart of the work is a deep investment in people. And before I was a novelist, I was really skeptical, maybe even annoyed, when novelists said this silly thing like, "Oh, I don't know what my characters do. They tell me what to do," you know. And I thought, "Oh, come on, you're writing them. You know, this is not a trance, you know." But then I became a novelist, and boy, is that true. And I think, when I think about it, I realize what happens is that when you're building a character, you're creating a matrix for them, a set of restrictions. And if you're faithful to that rubric for them, you'll realize that there are definitely things they will not do. You will betray that matrix. And the matrix starts to become very different from you. And I swear, there are times where I literally come up to the character behind them with my little notebook, and I said, "Please tell me what you're gonna do, because I wouldn't do that, but you will. And can you please tell me how to go forward? What will you do?" And that's because you've built a kind of simulation. And on the more interesting days, I wonder, like, gosh, if there is a God, is that what it's like? That the God has built a matrix and he's just behind us saying, what are you gonna do? I don't know. I made you. I think you should go that way, but I don't think you will you? Right? But I do show up to their world, and I'm absolutely beholden to them. That has changed me as a person, and I realize that so much of it is out of my control. And the greatest capacious role of the novelist, perhaps, is not to fill and make a world, but to make space so that the characters can be truly themselves. And I know it sounds so corny, even in my head it does, but they start to teach you things that you don't have in you. And I swear, I think some of these characters are a lot better as a person than I am, because I've launched them into this very specific tendency. And there are times where I ask of them, like, what goodness you have in you that you can teach me, because I wouldn't do the same things that you do. And so if you're faithful to that, you realize that you are really following the quest, and the actions soon become more inevitable than the idea of the authorial, omniscient author often suggests.
I wish we could talk for like 5 more hours. I can see we're really close to time, but I'm going to ask one more audience question. And it's a fitting one for the last, and that is, when do you know a book is done and ready to be released into the world? Because I never feel like a book is done, but I'm curious if you have a different answer.
It's never done.
Right?
It's never done.
Like, if they let us, we'd just hold on to them forever.
Well, I don't think anything. A book is like a photograph album. You know, it's like you look at a photo album and you look at time frozen. You look at a photo of yourself 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and it's stilled, it's captured. Meanwhile, you have grown. And so a book is, I don't think, it's just the calcification of a thought process. And you have to end it if you want to make your work shareable. But if there is a time, maybe soon, where I can just beam new drafts into people's heads, I would do it in a heartbeat, you know. So there's a comma in here that it keeps me up at night.
Oh no.
I'm not going to tell you where it is. Don't look. I'm not going to tell you. But there is a comma. I already wrote to my editor. I'm like, second printing, we're moving that comma. It needs to be 2 sentences. I'm literally itchy thinking about it. So to answer your question, it is still happening.
Right.
The book is an organic being. And it's a beautiful thing, I think, to allow the energy to continue. The book is porous. The sentence is a conductor. Why can I read a sentence from Sappho over 2,000 years ago and still feel the loneliness, the grief right into me? How did that get recorded in the line, and how is that energy conducted into me? I'll never know. But I do feel there is something deeply mysterious about this, and the words themselves are not enough to elucidate it, but the whole package becomes this series of conducting. And so I'm just really, really grateful I get to move the commas.
I think too, maybe in a way, what you're saying is also, for you, in a sense, it's the act of being read. Like it's readers engaging with your work, right? And scrutinizing commas, which we're all gonna go home and do now. But like that's kind of, it wouldn't be done until that step happens. Yeah. Like, yeah.
And I wanted to kind of, I'll leave with this tidbit. I wanted to honor that idea of multiplicity and reader agency. I'm never an author that would sit here and say, oh, you got it wrong. You're an idiot. You got it wrong. I meant this thing. You have a different interpretation. It's literally linguistically not possible. If I said the word winter, every single one of us would have a different image. One word, one definition, but you will all have a different set of connotations. And so for me, I do feel it's sacred that we work in a medium wherein the completion of our work does not finish it. This is just text. It does not become story until an individual human being read it in their mind. And so, unlike painters or sculptors, our work is not finite. We work in gestures. The book is a series of signs, and the completion of it demands and invites the reader to bring their own set of experiences to it, which is why in this book, at the ending, there are 3 possible interpretations to the ending. And there is enough textual evidence to support all 3, but not enough to determine any one of them. And that was really important for me to do.
I love that about this book and about all your work, just the way the impetus is truly on us as the readers to let the language wash over us and to just like have our own relationship to the book. Thank you so much, my friend. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
No.